Today's lecture series, we are going to be tackling the nutrient cycle, or in other words, how do we cycle through the synapse, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur through our closed biological system. We got to remember, since Earth is formed, there hasn't been much in the way of new matter coming in from outside of Earth's system, except for the occasional meteorites and such. And so how do we get those atoms, those synapses, to be able to cycle through so that it can continue allowing life to be able to thrive? And so we're going to be looking at these synapses through different cycles. So the nutrients we're talking about would be carbon, nitrogen, water, which again, that would be the HO of our synapse that we've been talking about, okay? Now, we know that these atoms go into making our macromolecules, okay? And one thing is, again, Earth is a closed system, and we got to remember from what we learned in chemistry, that matter's never created or destroyed, only rearranged. So let's kind of dive into the water cycle. So hydrogen and oxygen don't necessarily when we talk about the water cycle, we're talking about a situation in which water is going through the many different phases in Earth's system. And so these are some of the big ones that we want to talk about here. Obviously, let's start in the ocean. We're starting off as liquid oxygen, and through adding the heat, goes from liquid to a gas state through evaporation. And here's the thing, when you go up into the air, the temperature starts to drop. And so that gas then starts to condense into, well, clouds, okay? Now, the ocean's not only the one that's releasing water into the air, we also have transpiration. And this is O2 that is leaving from the stomatas of the trees because of, again, that heat is going to cause water to evaporate. And they go up into the air. And with all weather systems, you know, when you have a mixture of cold and hot, eventually the water becomes so heavy that it falls down as liquid precipitation. And that liquid then, whatever runoff goes to streams and then rivers and then back into the ocean itself. Now, also underneath our feet, a lot of times we have these aqueducts, and that water from that rain goes into the aqueducts. Now, here's the thing about the water cycle, especially with human interactions, is that whenever you introduce any kind of pollutant to the water, it doesn't go away. The water's cycling, but those chemicals, the pollution, all of that that's dumped in the water stays in the water. It just doesn't go away. And so we kind of have to remember that, and we have limited amounts of fresh water that follow this particular cycle. Basic of the water cycle. That's how we are able to get new water, fresh water, all of those good things. So that takes care of the ocean. And so again, when we talk about precipitation, that's going from from the atmosphere down, evaporating, going from liquid to gas, condensation, going from gas back into liquid, transpiration, that's where it's going to go from liquid to gas, percolation, infiltration, that's going to be liquid going into those ducts. And then the runoff, obviously, is where it goes to streams, rivers, and that's the beach portion, oceans, okay? Let's talk about the sea, the carbon. Now, carbon's one we definitely want to make sure to know because, well, we talked about carbon being the essential element. It's the one that kind of is the most versatile, can form many different bonds, and it makes up the backbones of all of our macromolecules. So we are a very carbon-based life form. So how does that carbon get cycled through? All right, so let's just imagine we are a CO2 molecule in the air here. So first thing that's going to happen is my CO2 is going to be taken out of the atmosphere and given to photosynthesis. So we're going to be taken out. And we know that with photosynthesis that it needs water and carbon dioxide to make glucose and oxygen. Now, this carbon dioxide through photosynthesis is produced into glucose, which is that C6H12O6. So we're not carbon dioxide anymore. We are now this glucose, all right? Now, where can we go? Well, the next thing is going to be, well, that glucose, for heterotrophs, we're not able to make that energy like photosynthetic organisms. And so that glucose is going to be then eaten by the heterotroph. In this case, would be the goat. Now, the goat's going to eat that glucose, and with oxygen, it's going to make ATP energy, but as a waste product of cellular respiration, it's CO2 gas, all right? So take a deep breath out. Congratulations, you are now cycling CO2 back into the atmosphere, all right? So every time you breathe out, you're putting carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Now, you got to remember, we'll talk about this more, plants do both photosynthesis and cell respiration. So plants are also giving off CO2 gas as well. Now, they are taking out more CO2 than giving out, all right? So really, when we talk about photosynthesis, it's really kind of taking CO2 out of the air because that's the net production here. Now, also within this, some of that glucose then goes into making a lot of the carbons of our macromolecules. And eventually, just like everybody's going to experience, you're going to die. And through the help of bacteria and funguses, your carbons will then be distributed back into the soil through decay, okay? Now, here's the deal. Those carbons, over millions of times with heat and pressure, eventually transform into fossil fuels, okay? We're talking oil, gas, coal. And that carbon then goes into our factories to be burned to spin a turbine to make electricity. It's my little lightning bolt. But here's the thing, when you burn coal, when you burn gas, when you burn oil, you're releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. And so burning fossil fuels is then contributing to producing CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, this could be an issue because when we have more carbon going into the atmosphere than taken out, then it starts to build up. And one of the things with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that it does a good job of trapping heat. So when it goes in, when sunlight goes into a system, because of the CO2, it stays in there and ends up warming the earth overall. And so, because of these organisms and abiotic materials taking in and out carbon, we have a few situations where we have what's known as carbon sinks, where they store the carbon out of the atmosphere. And so as a result, they lower the amount of CO2 that's in the air. So this is done through plants, more trees, more photosynthesis is going to happen, more CO2 is going to be taken out. The atmosphere itself is a CO2 sink, all right? There's carbon dioxide that's there. Now, one of the problems is that this sink is growing, whereas the other sinks like trees, fossil fuels, and oceans, well, they store the CO2, but unfortunately, we are burning those fossil fuels, so that's becoming less, and so we're adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. We're adding more animals, that's going to produce more CO2. So whenever these carbon sinks get messed with, well, they're unfortunately going to produce more carbon, which is going to end up warming the earth a little bit more. And so remember, these two organisms, autotrophs and heterotrophs, both are vital in transporting that carbon within our biological system. All right, so we've done carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All right, next is nitrogen. So this is what is needed for our proteins and such, and our nucleic acids. So just like we said, we need it for proteins, so enzymes, muscles, and the such, and then we have our genetic material, DNA, and RNA. We can also add ATP to that mix as well. So how does nitrogen get cycled? Well, as you find out, okay, Nitrogen is just as important as carbon and all of that, because if we don't have nitrogen, we can't have reproduction. We can't have structure, enzymes, muscles. So, when we talk about nitrogen, there's something different about nitrogen than carbon, okay? So, in reality, when we're breathing in our air, if you take a deep breath in, you're gonna actually be breathing in mostly nitrogen. And you're like, great, I need nitrogen. Here's the problem, okay? Nitrogen, when it's in its gas state, is triple bonded. And unfortunately, we don't have the enzymes or the ability to be able to break those bonds down to use it. So if we can't breathe in nitrogen, we're gonna have to eat in nitrogen. But here's the problem. If most organisms can't break down nitrogen out of the air, then how does nitrogen get out of the air? Well, here's a few things. So let's start off with atmospheric nitrogen, all right? N2, again, that's that N triple bonded, too strong for this rabbit to simply just breathe in to get in. And so for nitrogen cycle, you have a very important organism called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, okay? I'm gonna highlight this because this is pretty doggone important. This bacteria is so essential for everything in terms of the nitrogen cycle because what they do, this bacteria takes this N2, and that is the organism that breaks it down from N2 into a usable form like ammonia, okay? And so this nitrogen-fixing bacteria then puts the nitrogen, that gets absorbed by the plants, and then finally we have our nitrogen that's in our plant. And so this rabbit can get that nitrogen from consumption or eating that plant, okay? Now, that's how, this is, again, nitrogen fixing bacteria. This is how we get nitrogen out of the air, okay? Now, a few other things can happen as well. The biggest one that contributes to nitrogen going back would be, well, decomposing, all right? Just like with organisms, their carbon will be broken down and decomposed into the ground. Nitrogen does the same thing. And when they're broken down into a form that can be taken in by plants as well. So nitrogen is such an important thing for all plants. Again, how do these plants get their nitrogen? They assimilate, or it gets absorbed into the roots and gets stored into the plant, and we get our nitrogen by eating those plants. And so again, that decomposers here is what's bringing back that nitrogen into the soil. So who brings nitrogen out of the air? It's going to be nitrogen-fixing bacteria and decomposers. All right, now, let's compare carbon and nitrogen cycle, all right? The big difference between both of these, well, first of all, one of the similarities is that they have to get nitrogen out of the air, okay? And so both have special processes to remove that gas out of the air. For nitrogen, it's going to be the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. For carbon, it's going to be photosynthesis. All right. Next would be the phosphorus cycle. Now, phosphorus is a little different. Phosphorus doesn't really exist as a gas on Earth, generally, okay? So, let's see how we're gonna go about this. So, what do we need phosphorus for? Well, we need this for our phospholipids, the cell membrane. We need phosphates for DNA and RNA to make up the backbone. So, really, the phosphorus cycle's kind of the major thing is that it's not a gas. And so we're not having photosynthesis. We're not having nitrogen fixing bacteria. There's really two things that drive the phosphorus cycle. One is going to be erosion, in which the phosphorus that's stored in the rocks, the sediment, over time through weathering, breaks down and gets introduced into the water, and we drink the water, okay? And that water then gets taken up by plants, which then we eat that phosphorus. Same thing as the other ones. Death and decomposition is another way that living organisms can be able to put phosphorus back into the environment. So phosphorus is definitely important for our DNA, and we get it for animals, we get it through consumption. Okay. So what's the component that's missing in this cycle that we've seen all others? Again, phosphorus does not exist in the atmosphere. Where do we get our phosphorus reservoirs? That's going to be rocks, our sediment, and that gets broken down and absorbed by the plants, and we eat them through consuming. All right. And that concludes our lecture on the different nutrient cycles that exist on Earth.